The dust had not yet settled from her horse's hooves when every man in Caldwell, Kansas stopped what he was doing and stared. Because a woman dressed head to toe in widow's black did not ride into a cattle town alone in the summer of 1878, unless she was either desperate or dangerous, and Margaret Fairchild happened to be a measure of both. She sat straight in the saddle the way a woman sits when she has learned that posture is the only armor available to her, her dark dress pressed neat against the Kansas wind, her chestnut mare threading carefully between the wagon ruts that scarred the main street like old wounds. A black veil was pinned back from her face, and her face itself was the kind of face that people described later to their wives using words like composed and then fell silent, because composed was not quite right either. There was something underneath that composure, something that moved the way water moves beneath river ice, present and powerful and very cold. She pulled her mare to a halt outside the Cattleman's Rest, which served as the town's saloon, hotel, and occasional courthouse, depending on the hour and the severity of the business being conducted. She dismounted without assistance, which several of the men watching found both impressive and faintly unsettling, and she tied the mare's reins to the post with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times before and expected to do it 10,000 times more. A boy of perhaps 12 sat on the boardwalk whittling at a stick and watching her with the frank and unguarded curiosity that only children and very old people allow themselves. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of a hat that was 2 sizes too large for him, "you got kin in Caldwell." Margaret looked at him steadily. "I have business in Caldwell," she said. Her voice was clear and unhurried, a voice that had done a great deal of speaking in empty rooms and had learned not to need an echo. "Is there a man named Cyrus Dole in this town?" The boy's expression shifted in a way that told her more than words would. The openness closed up like a shutter banging shut against a storm. "Yes, ma'am," he said carefully. "Mr. Dole runs the land office." "Thank you," Margaret said, and she straightened her gloves and walked toward the Cattleman's Rest because she needed a room before she needed a confrontation, and she had learned in the past 8 months that order mattered. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the particular smell of men who spent their days in the sun and their evenings indoors. A piano sat against one wall, currently silent. 3 cowboys occupied a table near the window playing cards with the resigned patience of men who have nowhere else to be. Behind the bar stood a woman of about 50 with copper-red hair gone generously gray at the roots, wiping a glass with a cloth that had seen better decades. The woman behind the bar was named Hetty Morse, and she had been running the Cattleman's Rest for 11 years since her husband Clifford had been carried off by a fever, and she had a reputation in Caldwell for being fair, sharp, and possessed of no patience whatsoever for foolishness. She looked Margaret up and down with the frank appraisal of someone who has seen enough to know that widow's black on a woman that young meant trouble had already happened and more was likely coming. "Room," Hetty said. "Room," Margaret confirmed, "and board if it's available. I may be here some days. $1 a night, meals included. $2 if you want the room with the window that faces away from the stockyards." Hetty set the glass down. "You look like the kind of woman who would prefer the window away from the stockyards." "You read people well," Margaret said, and produced the $2 from a small leather purse that clinked with more coins than it looked like it should hold. Hetty took the money, studied Margaret for a moment, and then said, "I won't ask your business and I won't ask about the black, but I'll tell you this for free. Whatever brought you to Caldwell, be careful who you trust. This town has its decent people, but it also has Cyrus Dole." Margaret met her eyes. "I have already been warned about Cyrus Dole," she said, "by my husband's lawyer 3 weeks before my husband died. It seems the warning came too late to save Thomas, but it came in time to send me here." Hetty looked at her for another long moment, and something in her expression softened around the edges. "I'll bring you up some supper," she said. "It's a long ride from wherever you came from." "Wichita," Margaret said. "And yes, it is." She was given the key to room 4, which was up a narrow staircase, and along a short hall that smelled of sawdust and lye soap. The room itself was plain and clean, with an iron-framed bed, a washstand, a small table, and the promised window that looked out over a side street toward the open prairie where the grass rolled silver and gold in the late afternoon light. Margaret stood at that window for a long time after Hetty brought up the supper tray, not eating, just looking at the prairie, and whatever she was thinking she kept to herself. She had been 27 years old when Thomas Fairchild married her in St. Louis, which was 4 years ago now, and she had gone into that marriage with a practical heart and genuine affection, and the reasonable expectation that a man who presented himself as steady and honest was, in fact, steady and honest. Thomas had been both of those things for the first 2 years. The third year he had gotten involved with Cyrus Dole on a land deal in Kansas, and the fourth year he had died in what the coroner in Wichita had recorded as a riding accident, except that Thomas Fairchild had grown up on horseback in Missouri, and the horse in question had no injuries consistent with a fall, and the land Thomas had owned in Kansas had been transferred to Cyrus Dole's name 3 days before the accident. Margaret had spent 8 months gathering what information she could gather, paying a lawyer named Edmund Pratt everything she had left after Thomas's debts were settled, and Edmund Pratt had told her that the law in Wichita could not touch Cyrus Dole because Cyrus Dole had friends in the law in Wichita, but that there was a territorial judge named Harlan Briggs who traveled through Caldwell every autumn on his circuit, and if evidence could be placed before Judge Briggs, it was possible that justice could happen in the way that justice occasionally happened in Kansas in 1878, slowly and imperfectly, but happening nonetheless. So Margaret had ridden to Caldwell with the letters and the documents that Edmund Pratt had assembled, with what was left of her money, and with the particular kind of determination that is born when grief transforms itself, as grief sometimes does, into purpose. She ate her supper at the window and watched the light die over the prairie and told herself she was not frightened, and it was mostly true. The next morning she came downstairs to find the saloon doing a reasonable breakfast business. The same 3 cowboys at the same table now eating rather than playing cards, and a fourth man she had not noticed the evening before sitting alone at the bar with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper that he was reading with deep concentration. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with the kind of build that came from actual physical work rather than deliberate cultivation, broad through the shoulders and lean through the middle, his dark hair a little longer than fashion strictly demanded and pushed back from his forehead in a way that suggested he had been running his hand through it. He wore working clothes, clean but worn, and a badge on his shirt that caught the morning light. Margaret noticed the badge. She was noticing everything in Caldwell, cataloging it the way that 8 months of careful preparation had trained her to do. She took a seat at the far end of the bar and Hetty appeared with coffee without being asked, which Margaret appreciated. She was studying the paper in her reticule, the summary of documents that Edmund Pratt had prepared, when the man with the badge folded his own paper and set it aside and became aware of her the way that men in law enforcement sometimes become aware of things that appear in their town unexpectedly. "Morning," he said. He had a voice that matched his appearance, unhurried and direct without being aggressive. "You came in yesterday." "I did," Margaret said. "Roy Abbott," he said. "I'm the sheriff here." She looked at him then properly. His eyes were a shade of brown that was almost amber in the morning light, and they had the quality of looking at you without making you feel examined, which she found unusual in a lawman. "Margaret Fairchild," she said. "From Wichita." "Long ride," he said. "People keep mentioning that," she said. Something moved in his expression that might have been amusement. "What brings you to Caldwell, Mrs. Fairchild?" "Business," she said, as she had said to the boy the day before. Then she considered Roy Abbott for a moment, weighing him the way she had learned to weigh people in the past 8 months, and she said, "I have an appointment with your territorial judge when he comes through in October. In the meantime, I intend to file a formal complaint with the county recorder against Cyrus Dole." Roy Abbott's expression did not change dramatically, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "That is a serious undertaking," he said. "It is a serious matter," she said. He was quiet for a moment, drinking his coffee. "Cyrus Dole is not a man who responds well to formal complaints," he said. "He has considerable influence in this county." "I am aware of that," Margaret said. "I am also aware that his influence does not extend to territorial judges, which is why I am waiting for Judge Briggs rather than attempting to address this through the county courts." Roy looked at her steadily. "You've thought this through." "I have thought about little else for 8 months," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that made the words carry more weight than their surface meaning, and Roy heard it. "Your husband," he said carefully. It was not quite a question. "My husband owned land in Sumner County," she said. "He died in April. His land was transferred to Cyrus Dole's name in January. I have documentation." Roy set his coffee cup down slowly. "The Fairchild parcel," he said, "out on the North Fork." Margaret looked at him with sudden sharp attention. "You know it?" "I know the transfer," Roy said. "I didn't know the man who lost it or how he lost it." He paused. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Fairchild." The words were simple, and he meant them simply. And Margaret, who had heard those words from a great many people over the past 8 months in a great many complicated ways, heard the simplicity in them and was briefly grateful for it. "Thank you," she said. They finished their respective coffees in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which Margaret thought was notable for two people who had been speaking for less than 10 minutes. Then Roy stood and settled his hat and said, "I ride out to the north part of the county most mornings. If you'd care to see the land in question before you file your complaint, I'd be willing to take you. Might be useful to have documentation of its current condition." Margaret considered this. She was not in the habit of accepting offers from strangers, particularly male strangers who held positions of authority in towns she had entered alone and in widow's black. But Edmund Pratt had said that Roy Abbott was an honest man, had written it in his letter of recommendation of Caldwell as a place to wait for Judge Briggs, and Edmund Pratt was himself an honest man, and Margaret had learned to trust the recommendations of honest men even when she was not yet sure she trusted the men themselves. "That would be useful," she said. "Thank you, Sheriff." "Roy," he said. "Everyone calls me Roy." "Everyone calls me Margaret," she said, "though most people decide to call me Mrs. Fairchild for some time first." "I'll call you Mrs. Fairchild," he said, "until you tell me to call you Margaret." She found, to her own mild surprise, that she appreciated this also. They rode out the following morning, which was a Thursday, the first full day of August. The Kansas summer was in its full and uncompromising glory, the sky an enormous blue with clouds that moved fast in from the west and cast running shadows over the grass. Margaret rode her chestnut mare, whose name was Clover, a name she had given her 5 years ago when she bought her as a 2-year-old, and which she acknowledged was not a very impressive name for a horse that had carried her through considerable difficulty. But the horse did not seem to mind. Roy rode a gray horse named simply Gray, which Roy acknowledged was also not a very impressive name. "We are both bad at naming horses," Margaret said, and Roy laughed, which was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was a good laugh, uncomplicated and genuine. The North Fork of Slate Creek ran through a parcel of land that was, Margaret could see immediately, excellent land. The grass was good and the water was reliable, and there was a stand of cottonwood trees along the creek bank that would provide shade and shelter. Someone had begun to build a house on the parcel, a stone foundation and the start of walls, before the work had been abandoned. "Thomas started that in the autumn of last year," Margaret said, stopping Clover at the edge of the parcel and looking at the unfinished foundation. "He wrote to me about it. He had plans drawn. He was going to bring me here in the spring." Roy sat his horse beside her and said nothing for a moment, because there was nothing to say that would help. The foundation stood there in the Kansas sun like a sentence that had been stopped mid-word. "Dole has not put anyone on this land," Roy said eventually. "He filed the transfer, but he hasn't used the parcel, which is interesting. Edmund Pratt says he does this, Margaret said. He acquires parcels and holds them. He sells them to the railroads when the time is favorable. The land itself does not matter to him. The people who owned it do not matter to him. No, Roy said, they do not. His voice had gone quiet in a way that suggested this was not the first time he had encountered Cyrus Dole's methods in his capacity as sheriff of Caldwell. Margaret turned to look at him. Has he done this to others? Roy looked at her directly. 2 other families that I know of, he said. A rancher named Peterson, who left the county 3 years ago. After Dole foreclosed on a debt that Peterson maintains, he had already paid. And a man named Hector Salinas, who owned property south of town and who was killed in a fire that Dole's lawyer claimed was accidental. He paused. I could not prove otherwise, Mrs. Fairchild. I want to be honest with you about that. What I could prove and what I knew to be true were different things, and in my capacity as a sheriff I am constrained by what I can prove. That is why I am waiting for Judge Briggs, Margaret said. Edmund Pratt says the judge is not constrained by Dole's friendships. That is true, Roy said. Harlan Briggs is a hard man, but he is a just one. He will listen to evidence. He looked at the unfinished foundation again. And it sounds as though you have evidence. I have letters, Margaret said. Letters Thomas wrote to me in the months before he died, in which he described his dealings with Dole and his growing concern that Dole intended to take the land by means that were not legitimate. I have records from the Wichita Land Office showing the dates of the transfer against the date of Thomas's death. I have a statement from the man who was with Thomas the morning he died, a ranch hand named Collins who was dismissed from his position by Dole 1 week after Thomas's accident, which Edmund Pratt was able to locate and take a sworn statement from. She paused. And I have the testimony I can give myself. Roy was quiet for a moment and then he said, That is substantial. I hope it is enough. I think it is enough, he said, and the way he said it was not reassuring flattery but an assessment, the kind a person makes when they have looked at facts and arrived at a conclusion. Margaret, who was tired of being reassured, found the assessment more comforting than any amount of reassurance would have been. They rode back to Caldwell in the late morning, and Cyrus Dole saw them coming in from the north together, because Cyrus Dole's office in the land office building had a window that faced the main road, and Cyrus Dole was the kind of man who spent a great deal of time looking out of windows. Margaret filed her complaint with the county recorder that afternoon. The county recorder, a thin, anxious man named Jasper Howell, received the paperwork with visible discomfort and told her that Mr. Dole would be notified of the complaint as was required by county procedure. Margaret told him she understood and thanked him politely, and left before his discomfort could extend itself into something that actually impeded her filing. She was walking back toward the Cattleman's Rest when Cyrus Dole himself stepped out of the land office and fell into step beside her. Cyrus Dole was 51 years old and looked exactly like a man who had spent 30 years getting what he wanted by means that did not bear close examination. He was heavy through the middle and carefully dressed, with the kind of surface politeness that was itself a threat. He had small dark eyes that did not smile when his mouth did. "Mrs. Fairchild," he said pleasantly, "what a surprise." "Is it?" Margaret said. She did not slow her pace. "I heard you had come to Caldwell. I had hoped to speak with you before you took any hasty actions." "I have not taken any hasty actions," Margaret said. "I have been planning my actions for 8 months, Mr. Dole. They are not hasty." Now, he said, in the tone that men use when they are speaking to a woman they have already decided to dismiss. "I understand you are grieving. Thomas's death was a terrible thing, but the land transfer was perfectly legal. Your husband had debts, Mrs. Fairchild." "My husband did not owe you that land," Margaret said. She stopped walking and turned to face him, and whatever was in her face made Dole himself take a half step back before he caught himself. "My husband wrote to me about his debts, Mr. Dole. He was meticulous in his accounting. The debt you presented to the land office was fabricated." Dole's polite expression did not waver, but his eyes went cold. "That is a serious accusation." "I am aware of that," Margaret said, precisely as she had said it to Roy Abbott the morning before, except that the conversation with Roy Abbott had felt like the beginning of something, and this conversation felt like exactly what it was, which was a man attempting to intimidate her. "I have made it formally. I will make it again before Judge Briggs in October. I suggest you consult your lawyer." She walked away from him and did not look back, and her hands were steady at her sides, which cost her considerably more than it appeared to. That evening, sitting in the Cattleman's Rest saloon with a cup of tea that Hetty had procured for her from somewhere because Margaret had mentioned she preferred tea to coffee, she told Roy about the encounter. Roy listened without interrupting, which she was beginning to understand was characteristic of him. "He'll move against you," Roy said when she finished. "Not violently, not directly, but he'll try to discredit you or frighten you off." "I know," Margaret said. "What form do you think it will take?" Roy considered. "He'll talk," he said. "He'll tell people your documents are forged. He'll suggest your husband's death affected your mind. He has enough influence in this town that some people will listen." "Will they listen to you?" Margaret asked. Roy met her eyes. "Some of them will," he said. "The ones whose opinion is worth having, yes." She nodded slowly. They were sitting across from each other at a corner table, and the evening light came through the window at a low angle and made the room look warmer than it was. Outside, someone was playing a harmonica somewhere down the street, a slow, wandering melody that had no clear resolution. "May I ask you something?" Roy said. "Yes," she said. "Did you love him, your husband?" It was a question that no one had asked her, in all of the 8 months of condolences and legal consultations and careful preparations. Everyone had assumed the answer or avoided the question. She looked at Roy for a moment, considering both the question and the fact that he had asked it. "I cared for him deeply," she said. "I respected him. I was beginning, I think, to understand what love between married people actually is, the daily kind, the built kind." She paused. "We had not had enough time for it to fully become what it might have been. I think I grieve the possibility as much as the man." Roy nodded, and in his nod was the kind of comprehension that is not performative, the comprehension of someone who has also lost things and knows the particular grief of lost possibility. "And you?" she said, because the question had been between them like a held breath and she had decided she would rather breathe. "Have you been married?" "No," he said. "There was a woman some years back in Abilene before I came to Caldwell. She married another man, which was the right decision for her and probably for me, though it didn't feel that way at the time." He said it simply, without self-pity, which she appreciated. "How long have you been in Caldwell?" she asked. "4 years," he said. "I came in '74 when the cattle trade was at its height and they needed a sheriff who wasn't afraid of Texas drovers." He smiled slightly. "The cattle trade has quieted since then. The work is different now, more property disputes, more of what Dole represents. Land becoming valuable and men becoming dangerous over it." "The frontier closing," Margaret said. "Yes," Roy said. "That's exactly it, the frontier closing." They sat in a comfortable quiet for a moment, and then Hetty came and removed the teacup and gave Margaret a look that was composed of equal parts approval and maternal warning. And Margaret thought that Hetty Morse was one of the most interesting women she had encountered in some time. The first week of August passed, and then the second. Margaret settled into a routine that had both purpose, and she was surprised to find, a quality of ordinary life that she had not expected. She went each morning to the small desk in her room and worked through her documents, organizing and reorganizing, preparing the case she would present to Judge Briggs in a way that Edmund Pratt had told her would be most effective. She helped Hetty in the afternoon sometimes, not from obligation, but because the work of running a saloon hotel was interesting, and Hetty was interesting, and keeping her hands occupied kept her mind from running down paths that were not productive. And in the evenings, more often than not, she found herself at that corner table with Roy Abbott. It happened gradually and naturally in the way that things happen when two people are both paying attention, and neither is being deliberately careful about the distance between them. They talked about the land, about the law, about Kansas and Missouri, and the way the West was changing. They talked about what they had read, and Roy Abbott, she discovered, had read considerably more than his occupation might have suggested, keeping a small shelf of books in his office that he worked through systematically. They talked about what they believed, about fairness and justice and the gap between them, which was considerable, and which both of them felt as a daily professional reality. One evening in the middle of August, a thunderstorm came through Caldwell with the full theatrical force of a Kansas summer storm, lightning cracking the sky open over the prairie and rain hammering the roof of the cattleman's rest with a sound like applause. The three cowboys who lived in the saloon's back room were all present, and old Pete Garfield, who ran the livery, was sitting at the bar, and Hetty was behind it, and Margaret and Roy were at their corner table. The storm made the room feel enclosed and warm, and the harmonica player from down the street appeared in the doorway shaking water from his hat and was waved in by Hetty, and after a glass of whiskey, he played something slow and sweet that was not quite a waltz but had that quality of gentle movement, and Margaret found herself watching Roy's hands on the table, which were broad and capable, and at rest the way hands are at rest when the person they belong to is genuinely content rather than merely still. "You grew up in Missouri?" Roy asked. They had been talking about St. Louis and she had mentioned her childhood there. "Born and raised," she said. "My father was a school teacher. My mother kept a boarding house after he died. I grew up serving tables and doing accounts." "That explains the efficiency," Roy said, and it was not a criticism, just an observation, and she found herself smiling at it. "Is efficiency a notable quality?" she said. "In a woman who rides into a cattle town alone in widow's black and files a formal complaint against the most powerful man in the county within 24 hours of arrival," Roy said. "I'd say efficiency is among the more notable qualities, yes." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed, a real laugh in a considerable period of time, and it surprised her, the ease of it, the physical relief of it. Roy looked at her when she laughed, and something in his expression changed in a way that he was probably not aware of, or not entirely. It was the kind of change that happens when someone watches a person do something that they had hoped to see but had not dared to expect. Margaret noticed it. She had been noticing Roy Abbott for 2 weeks with the same careful attention she brought to everything else, and what she had assembled over those 2 weeks was a portrait of a man who was not performing decency, but simply was decent, which was both simpler and considerably rarer than it sounded. He was fair with people regardless of their station. He treated the Mexican workers who came through town seasonally with the same directness and respect that he gave the cattle barons. He had, she learned from Hetty, stood between Cyrus Dole's hired men and a Cherokee family who had a property dispute with Dole 2 years previously, and had done it alone on the main street at midday with no particular fuss, which Hetty described as characteristic. He was also, she was aware in a way that she had not yet fully acknowledged to herself, very much the kind of man that a woman who had married practical and affectionate, and been widowed young, might find herself thinking about in the late evenings when the room was quiet, and the prairie wind was doing its low and constant singing at the window. She acknowledged it to herself on the 3rd Friday of August, sitting at the window with a letter to Edmund Pratt half-written on the table before her, when she caught herself describing Roy Abbott to Edmund Pratt in considerably more detail than Edmund Pratt had asked for or required, and she stopped and set the pen down and sat for a moment with the fact of it. She was not ready, she told herself. She was in widow's black. She was in the middle of a legal battle that could still go badly. She was a woman who had been in Caldwell for 3 weeks, which was not sufficient time to develop reliable feelings about a man. But the feelings were there, she acknowledged to herself, sitting at the window with the prairie going silver in the late evening light. They were there in the particular attention she paid to his voice when he spoke, and in the particular quality of the evenings at that corner table, and in the way that the morning rides out to look at the land, or ride the county on various sheriffing business had become the part of the day she looked forward to most. They were there, and they were not going away simply because she told herself they were not appropriate. She rewrote the letter to Edmund Pratt and left out the excess detail about Roy Abbott and sent it with the southbound mail, and she went downstairs and had supper with Hetty because Roy was out of town on county business that day, and she told herself she was not noticing his absence. She was absolutely noticing his absence. Hetty, who noticed everything in her establishment the way a sea captain notices weather, said nothing about it directly but did, in the middle of supper, say, "Roy Abbott is a good man. I have known him 4 years and I have not found a crack in him yet." Margaret looked at her. "I'm not certain what you mean by that," she said. Hetty looked back at her with the candid and entirely unembarrassed regard of a woman of 50 who has decided she has earned the right to be direct. "I think you know exactly what I mean," Hetty said. "I'm not suggesting anything. I am simply noting it, for the record." Margaret ate another bite of her supper. "I am in widow's black," she said. "I know what you're wearing," Hetty said. "I also know that grief and life are not mutually exclusive, and that Thomas Fairchild, from what you've told me about him, was a man who would have wanted his wife to keep living." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said finally, "he was exactly that kind of man." Roy came back the following evening, dusty from the road, and carrying a letter from the territorial judge's office that confirmed Judge Briggs would be in Caldwell on the 15th of October, which was 6 weeks away. He found Margaret in the saloon with this news and spread the letter on the table between them, and she read it twice, and then looked up at him with something in her eyes that was not quite relief and not quite triumph, but was somewhere between the two. The look of someone who has held very tightly to a thread for a very long time and has just felt it become a rope. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks, he confirmed. Plenty of time to have your documents in order and your witnesses arrived and your case organized. She nodded, still looking at the letter. I need to write to Edmund Pratt. He should come in person if he can. And Collins, the ranch hand, I need to ask Edmund whether Collins would come. Write tonight, Roy said. I'll have both letters on the northbound mail tomorrow morning. She looked up at him, and there was a moment, brief and clear as a bell tone, in which what was between them was entirely visible to both of them. Not yet spoken, not yet acted upon, but visible, the way something is visible just before the sun comes fully over the horizon. Thank you, Roy, she said, and the use of his given name was deliberate and he heard it. Of course, he said, and his voice was steady but his eyes were doing that thing again, that thing she had first noticed during the thunderstorm, the thing she no longer had any doubt about the meaning of. The end of August brought a different kind of trouble. Cyrus Dole had, as Roy had predicted, been talking. The story circulating in the more Dole-friendly quarters of Caldwell was that Margaret Fairchild was an unstable widow pursuing a grudge against a legitimate businessman, and that her documents were of questionable provenance, and that her late husband had been a poor manager who had borrowed against his property and failed to repay. The story had found purchase with some people, and Margaret encountered it in sideways glances, and the particular quality of silence that descends in a room when the person being talked about enters it. She bore it with composure, which was her practice, but the composure cost her, and one evening in early September she came down to supper with her jaw set in a way that Hetty recognized and Roy noticed immediately. What happened? Roy asked. Nothing dramatic, she said, sitting down. A woman at the dry goods store made a comment about Thomas, about his management of his affairs. She paused. It was the implication that he was weak or foolish that I find I cannot bear with equanimity. He was neither weak nor foolish. He was outmaneuvered by a man who had been practicing deception for 30 years, and that is a different thing. Yes, Roy said, it is a very different thing. I keep thinking, she said, and then stopped and pressed her lips together, and Roy waited. He had learned to wait for her, which she had noticed and which meant more to her than she had expected. I keep thinking that I am here to win this in October, and then I will go, back to Wichita, or St. Louis, back to wherever. She looked at the table. And then I wonder what I am going back to. The boarding house is let. Thomas's house is gone. I have the contents of his accounts and what I came here with and not a great deal else. Where do you want to go? Roy said. She was quiet for a long time. I am not sure, she said finally. I think I may want to go somewhere I have not been yet. She said it slowly, as though discovering it as she said it, which she was. Somewhere that is mine, not a place I shared or left or returned to. Somewhere new. Roy was looking at her in the early September light, the light that had that particular Kansas quality of richness and weight as the summer turned, and he said, quietly and directly, "What if somewhere new was here?" Margaret looked at him. "I'm not saying it carelessly," he said. "I want you to know that. I'm not a man who says things carelessly. But I have been sitting across this table from you for 5 weeks, and I think, if you will permit me to say so, that Caldwell is a better place than it was before you rode into it, and I would be sorry to see you ride back out." Margaret's heart was doing something complicated in her chest. She said carefully, "Roy, you don't have to say anything," he said. "I'm not asking for anything, I just wanted you to know." "I know," she said, and then, after a moment, "I am glad you said it." He nodded once, and the evening continued, and Hetty brought supper, and a harmonica was playing somewhere, and the prairie wind was at the window, and nothing was resolved, and everything was somehow better than it had been before. September moved through its first weeks with a quality of anticipation that had nothing to do with the change of seasons, though the seasons were changing, the mornings going cool and sharp, and the light taking on that particular clarity that only comes to the Kansas plains in autumn. The cottonwood trees along Slate Creek were turning, and Margaret knew because she and Roy rode out there twice more in September, ostensibly to document the condition of the parcel for the judge, and in fact because the North Fork of Slate Creek had become a place that was associated in both of their minds with something larger than a land dispute. One afternoon on one of those rides, they dismounted and walked along the creek bank in the cool shade of the cottonwoods, the horses drinking, and Margaret said, "What would you do with this land? If it were yours?" Roy considered it seriously, looking at the unfinished foundation and the curve of the creek and the good grass beyond it. "Cattle," he said. "A small operation, not the big Texas drives that's coming to its end anyway with the railroads moving south. Something sustainable, a working ranch, a real house." He paused. "A life on it." She looked at him. "Do you want to stop being a sheriff?" "I want to stop being only a sheriff," he said. "I am 32. I have been wearing a badge since I was 26, and it is work I believe in, and I am reasonably good at it. But it is not enough for a whole life." He looked at her, and the directness she had come to expect from him was there, but so was something more open than she usually saw. "I have been putting off thinking about what a whole life looks like. I think I was waiting, without knowing I was waiting." Margaret had been looking at the unfinished foundation while he spoke, and something was moving through her that was not the grief she had carried for 8 months, and was not quite the careful practicality that had gotten her this far, but was something older than either of those things, something that had to do with the October light on the water and the sound of the horses, and the particular quality of standing beside someone whose presence made the world feel larger rather than smaller. "Thomas wanted to build here," she said. "He described it to me in his letters, the foundation, the way the cottonwoods look in autumn. He wrote about it as a place we would come to, and I would read his letters in Wichita and try to imagine it." She paused. "I am standing in his description, and it is nothing like I imagined, and it is entirely what he said it was." Roy said nothing, but he moved slightly, just slightly, and his hand found hers at her side, not grasping, just present, his fingers alongside hers in a question. She turned her hand and laced her fingers through his, and they stood there in the cottonwood shade with the creek going past. And it was, she thought, one of the most profoundly peaceful moments she had experienced in a very long time. They rode back to Caldwell in the late afternoon, with the sky going orange and the shadows long on the grass, and they did not talk much on the ride back. But the silence was the kind of silence that two people share when they have said something important without words, and are both still listening to it. Edmund Pratt arrived in Caldwell on the 22nd of September, having traveled from Wichita by way of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, and then a stagecoach, a journey of 2 days that had left him somewhat compressed but entirely alert. He was a small, spare man of 50 with wire-rimmed spectacles and the contained energy of someone who channeled all unnecessary movement into thought. He shook Margaret's hand with both of his and said, "You look better than I feared," which from Edmund Pratt was a substantial compliment. He had brought Collins with him, the ranch hand who had been dismissed after Thomas's death. A wiry, weathered man of about 40 named Samuel Collins, who had the careful speech of someone who has been told repeatedly that his word would not be taken at face value, and has decided to give his word very carefully as a result. Margaret met him in the Cattleman's Rest and shook his hand and told him she was grateful he had come, and Samuel Collins looked at her with something like relief and said, "Mrs. Fairchild, I saw what happened to your husband. I've been wanting to speak to it in a proper legal setting since the day it happened." Roy met both men and assessed them quickly, and reported to Margaret that evening that he thought Collins was credible, and that Edmund Pratt was, in his professional estimation, exactly the kind of small, careful, tenacious lawyer that a case like this needed, which was the best possible news. The final weeks before Judge Briggs's arrival had a quality of concentrated preparation that Margaret found both exhausting and clarifying. She worked through the documents with Edmund Pratt for hours each day, going over every piece of evidence, anticipating the challenges that Dole's lawyer would bring, rehearsing the testimony she would give, until it was both completely true and completely clear. Roy sat in on some of these sessions and contributed what he knew from his own observations of Dole's methods in the county, and Samuel Collins told his version of Thomas's last days in Wichita carefully and coherently, and with the kind of detail that is either fabricated with extraordinary skill or entirely true, and was entirely true. Cyrus Dole made one more attempt to speak to Margaret alone, intercepting her outside the dry goods store on the 1st of October. This time his pleasant surface was thinner. He told her that she was making a serious mistake, that Judge Briggs was not the friend she imagined him to be, and that women who came to Kansas alone pursuing foolish grievances frequently found that Kansas was unkind to them. Margaret looked at him and said, "Mr. Dole, I will see you in court on the 15th. She told Roy about it that evening, and Roy's expression went very still in the way that she had come to understand meant he was being careful about what he did next. "That sounds like a threat," he said. "It was meant to," she said. "Do you feel unsafe?" She considered it honestly. "Less than I might have expected," she said. "Dole's power is in the shadows. He does not want direct confrontation because direct confrontation creates witnesses. What he wants is for me to leave before the 15th. Since I have no intention of leaving before the 15th, I think his options are narrower than he would like." Roy nodded slowly. "I'll keep a closer eye on things," he said. "On you." "I am capable of looking after myself," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I'd like to help anyway." She looked at him, and the feeling that had been building through the weeks of September was there at full strength, the full weight of what Roy Abbott was to her, not a protector, not a convenience, but a person whose presence in her world had become as necessary as clean water. "All right," she said softly. He kept his word. Through the 2 weeks before the hearing, Roy was a consistent presence, not overbearing, not hovering, but present, visible, a signal to anyone watching that Margaret Fairchild was not alone in Caldwell. This mattered more than she admitted and less than it would have if she were a different kind of woman, and she was grateful for both things. The 15th of October came to Caldwell on a morning so clear and cold that the mountains visible to the west were sharp as cut paper against the blue sky. Judge Harlan Briggs arrived the evening before on the Santa Fe stage, a large man of 60, with the deliberate movements of someone who has learned that appearing to be in a hurry rarely improves outcomes. He was accompanied by a court clerk and had a reputation that preceded him in the careful way that reputations do in small Western communities, traveling faster than the man himself and arriving shaped by the telling. The hearing was held in the Caldwell courthouse, which was the largest room in town not occupied by livestock, a wood frame building on the north end of the main street that served primarily as a meeting house, and on this morning had been arranged with chairs and a table, and the judge's bench elevated on a small platform that gave the proceedings as much gravitas as frontier architecture could provide. Cyrus Dole arrived with his lawyer, a man from Wichita named Clarence Webb, who wore a very good suit and the expression of a man who considered himself the smartest person in most rooms. Webb had made a career of representing men like Dole in cases like this one, and his confidence was considerable, and was, on this particular morning, somewhat premature. Edmund Pratt presented Margaret's case with the compact precision of a man who has been a lawyer for 25 years and knows that economy of language is a form of respect to a judge's intelligence. He presented the land records, the letters from Thomas, the coroner's report with its inconsistencies highlighted, and then he brought Samuel Collins forward, and Collins spoke for 35 minutes in a quiet and completely believable voice about what he had seen in the weeks before Thomas Fairchild's death, about the meetings between Thomas and Dole's men, about the debt document that Thomas had shown him with explicit distress and told Collins he had never signed, and about the morning Thomas died, which Collins described with the full and terrible clarity of a man who has been carrying the weight of it for 8 months. Webb cross-examined Collins with aggressive skill and found no cracks, because there were none. The story was true, and true stories are difficult to break when the person telling them has no reason to lie and every reason to tell the truth. Margaret took the stand in the early afternoon. She wore her widow's black, which she had worn every day since April, and she sat straight in the witness chair and answered every question Edmund Pratt asked her in a voice that did not waver, and when Webb attempted to suggest that her grief had distorted her judgment, she looked at him very steadily and said, "My husband was killed for a piece of land, Mr. Webb. My judgment about that is not distorted. It is the clearest judgment I possess." Judge Briggs listened to all of it with the focused and entirely impartial attention that was apparently his professional signature, making occasional notes, asking occasional questions that were pointed and revealed that he had been paying very close attention throughout. The hearing took most of the day. Dole's defense was that the debt was real and the transfer was legal and the death was an accident, and Clarence Webb made these arguments as skillfully as the evidence permitted, which was not, given the evidence, particularly skillfully. Judge Briggs issued his preliminary findings the following morning. He found that the evidence presented raised sufficient questions about the legitimacy of the debt instrument used to compel the land transfer that a full territorial court review was warranted. He further found that the conduct described in the testimony of Samuel Collins was consistent with a pattern of fraudulent land acquisition, and ordered Cyrus Dole to appear before the territorial court in Wichita in December. He also, and this was the part that made Edmund Pratt close his eyes briefly in the manner of a man receiving very good news, issued an injunction placing the Fairchild parcel on the North Fork of Slate Creek in trust pending the outcome of the territorial review, which meant Dole could neither sell it nor develop it while the case proceeded. It was not the complete resolution that Margaret had hoped for. The full verdict would not come until December at the earliest. But it was, Edmund Pratt told her outside the courthouse with the October sun on the empty street and the cottonwoods down by the creek flashing gold, substantially better than he had dared to hope. The injunction alone was significant. The territorial review meant Dole would face a court that was genuinely beyond his influence. Margaret stood on the boardwalk outside the courthouse and felt the autumn air on her face and felt something releasing, not completely, not all of it, but the tightly held breath of 8 months beginning slowly to let itself go. Edmund Pratt shook her hand with both of his, as he had when he arrived, and Samuel Collins touched his hat to her with a quiet dignity and said that he was glad he had come. And then both men went to find their supper, and Margaret stood there alone for a moment with the Kansas afternoon around her. Roy came out of the courthouse behind her and stood beside her on the boardwalk and said nothing, which was exactly right. "It's not over," she said. "No," he said, "but it's begun." She looked at him. He was standing in the October light, his hat in his hand for once because he had removed it inside the courthouse and not yet replaced it. And the light on his face was the same autumn light that was on the cottonwoods and the creek and the long grass beyond town. And everything was the same light. Everything was the same October afternoon. And Margaret Fairchild, who had ridden into this town in widow's black 8 months after her husband was killed, and who had spent 3 months preparing a case and falling into something she had not planned for, and who was 31 years old and had been careful and purposeful and composed, felt the last of the careful composure soften around the edges. "Roy," she said. He looked at her and waited. "I would like," she said carefully, "to stay in Caldwell." Something in his face opened in the way that a window opens when the latch is lifted after a long winter. "I would like that very much," he said. They stood there on the boardwalk with the whole open afternoon before them, and it was not a resolution, not yet. There were still things to be said and decided, and the territorial court was still in December, and the widow's black was still on her back. But it was something. It was a beginning of a different kind. The weeks that followed had a quality that Margaret would later describe, when asked to describe them, as the first weeks in almost a year when she felt as though she was living forward rather than looking back. She wrote to Edmund Pratt in Wichita regularly and received regular reports on the progress of the territorial case, which was moving slowly but steadily in the right direction. She helped Hetty with increasing frequency and genuine enjoyment, learning the rhythms of the cattleman's rest in a way that felt less like killing time and more like building something. And she spent her evenings, and a good portion of her mornings and afternoons, with Roy Abbott. They went on long rides together in the October and November days, the prairie gone gold and rust, and the sky enormous, and the horses pleased with the cool air. They talked about everything and nothing with the particular ease of two people who have discovered that each other's company is the most natural thing in the world. They talked about what they wanted, not abstractly but specifically, in the way that people talk when they have decided not to be vague about things that matter. Roy told her one afternoon in late October, stopped at the top of a low rise with the whole Sumner County spread below them, that he had spoken to Judge Briggs privately the morning after the hearing. He told the judge about the Salinas fire and the Peterson foreclosure, and the judge had listened and made notes, and said it was consistent with what the Collins testimony suggested and would be incorporated into the territorial investigation. "So it's not only Thomas," Margaret said. "No," Roy said. "It has never only been Thomas, but Thomas is what opened the door." She looked out over the prairie, and the grief that had been her constant companion for 8 months was still there, but was different now, shaped differently. No longer a weight that pressed her toward the ground, but something more like the foundation beneath her, the thing she had been built from and carried but was no longer being buried by. He would have been glad of that, she said, that it mattered for more than just him. "He sounds like a man who would have been glad of many things," Roy said. She looked at Roy then, and her heart did its complicated thing, and she said, "He would have liked you." Roy looked at her with something in his eyes that was both gentle and completely serious. "That matters to me," he said quietly. "I want you to know that. It matters to me that you could say that." She reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the saddle horn, just touched it briefly, and he turned his hand and held hers for a moment before they rode on. The territorial court convened in Wichita on the 3rd of December, and Margaret traveled to Wichita with Roy, who had been summoned to provide a statement regarding his own observations of Dole's conduct in Sumner County over 4 years. It was the first time Margaret had been back to Wichita since she left it in August, and the town looked different to her, smaller somehow, or not smaller but less final, less like the edge of things and more like a place she was passing through. The territorial court proceedings took 3 days. Dole's lawyer argued vigorously, and Dole himself sat through the proceedings with the contained fury of a man who is accustomed to having things resolved in his favor and is watching that resolution fail. Edmund Pratt was excellent. Collins was excellent. Margaret's own testimony was brief, supplementary, and the judge called it compelling. Roy testified for an hour about Dole's methods in Sumner County, and did so with the careful specificity of a man who has been paying attention for 4 years and written things down, which he had. The territorial court found for the plaintiff on the 4th of December. The land transfer was ruled fraudulent. The Fairchild parcel on the North Fork of Slate Creek was returned to Margaret's name. Cyrus Dole was charged with fraudulent conveyance and with conspiracy in the death of Thomas Fairchild, the latter charge carrying a sentence that would see him before a jury in the spring and would, both Edmund Pratt and Judge Briggs privately told Margaret, very likely result in a substantial prison term. Margaret heard the verdict in the courtroom and said nothing for a moment, and then she turned to Edmund Pratt and said, "Thank you." And Edmund Pratt looked at her over his wire-rimmed spectacles with an expression that was as close to emotional as she had ever seen him approach and said, "The work was yours, Mrs. Fairchild. I merely organized it." She found Roy in the corridor outside the courtroom. He took one look at her face and said, "It's done." "It's done," she said. He opened his arms, not tentatively but clearly, a clear and uncomplicated offer, and she stepped into them and put her face against his shoulder and held on, and he held her, and the courthouse corridor was plain and cold and smelled of lye soap and wood smoke, and it was one of the best moments of her life. They spent one night in Wichita before the southbound stage back to Caldwell, and Margaret walked through the town that evening, past the house she had shared with Thomas, which had been let to another family now, past the lawyer's office where she had first understood what Edmund Pratt believed had happened, past the church where she had sat in the pew every Sunday for 4 years. She walked through it all and said a private goodbye to the life she had lived there and to Thomas, who had been the beginning of her Kansas story even if he had not lived to see where it led, and she told him, standing on the empty street outside the church with the December stars enormous overhead, that she was all right, that she was going to be all right, and she was. She and Roy traveled back to Caldwell on the stage with Edmund Pratt, who was also returning to see to a few remaining matters in Sumner County, and the 3 of them talked about the case, and about what came next and about Caldwell in the general way that people talk about a place that has become significant. When they arrived in the late afternoon, Hetty was waiting on the boardwalk of the Cattleman's Rest, which was not usual for Hetty, and Margaret understood when she saw her that word had traveled ahead of them, as word did in Kansas, along the telegraph lines and the informal channels of people who paid attention. "Well," Hetty said. "In her favor," Roy said. Hetty looked at Margaret for a moment with those sharp and knowing eyes, and then she said, "Come inside. I'll heat the supper." That evening the Cattleman's Rest had a quality of celebration that was quiet rather than boisterous, the regulars present and aware that something good had happened without requiring details, a harmonica playing something celebratory, and a sense of the room being the right place at the right time. Margaret sat at the corner table that had become their table, and Roy sat across from her, and Hetty brought a bottle of wine that she had been keeping for what she described, when asked, as an appropriate occasion. They raised their glasses. Roy looked at her over the table in the lamplight, in the saloon that had been her home for 4 months, in the town she had ridden into alone and in black, and his eyes were doing the thing they did, the open thing. "To Thomas," Roy said. Margaret's throat tightened. "To Thomas," she said, "and to what comes next." They drank to both. The question of what came next was, they both knew before them, and neither of them was inclined to be indirect about it. 3 days after the return from Wichita, Roy came to the Cattleman's Rest not in the evening but in the morning, dressed more carefully than was his custom, his hat in his hand, and found Margaret at the corner table with her morning tea. He sat down across from her without preamble and said, "I want to say something I have been wanting to say since October." "Then say it," she said. He looked at her directly and said, "I want to build a life with you, Margaret. I want to build it here in Caldwell on that land if you're willing, a real house on that foundation your husband started, a life that would be ours together. I am asking you to marry me because I love you and because I cannot imagine the future I want without you in it." He paused and then added, with the honesty that was so fundamentally him, "I am also aware that you have had a very long and difficult year and that you may not be ready for this. I am not asking you to answer from urgency. I am asking you to know what I want and to tell me what you want when you are ready to tell me." Margaret sat with her tea and the morning light and Roy Abbott's amber eyes and the full, clear truth of what she wanted, which was not complicated and had not been complicated for some time, which was him. This man, this steady, honest, patient man who had made space for her grief and her purpose and her practicality and her grief-turned purpose, without once trying to diminish any of it, who had ridden with her to see the land and stood with her in the cottonwood shade, and held her hand in the courthouse corridor, and drunk to her husband at her corner table. "I am ready now," she said. "I have been ready for some time and have been waiting for the right moment to say so." She set down her teacup and looked at him with all of the composure she had and a good deal of the heart she had been protecting, and said, "Yes, Roy, I will marry you." He reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and his hands were warm and steady, and she felt the warmth of them all the way up to her shoulders. Hetty appeared from behind the bar with a dishcloth in her hand and an expression of absolutely magnificent unsurprise, and said, "Well, finally," and went back to wiping the bar with the satisfied air of a woman whose read of a situation has been thoroughly confirmed. They were married in the Caldwell Church on the 21st of January, 1879, which was a cold, clear day with the kind of winter light that makes everything look like it has been cut out of paper and set against a blue sky. The church was small and the gathering was not large, but it included everyone in Caldwell who mattered, which was more people than might have been expected given that Margaret had been in town only 5 months. Hetty was there with a dress that was considerably finer than anything she usually wore, and the expression of a woman who has won a private wager. Edmund Pratt had made the journey from Wichita for the occasion, which touched Margaret deeply. Samuel Collins was there, which touched her in a different way, the way that practical kindness touches you. Margaret wore a dress of deep blue wool that Hetty had helped her have made by a seamstress in town, because the widow's black she had ridden in with in August was packed away in the trunk under her bed at the Cattleman's Rest, and she was done with it. The blue dress was the color of the Kansas sky in October, which was the color of the month that she and Roy had really found each other, and she thought Thomas would have appreciated the symbolism, and then thought that Thomas would simply have been happy for her and left the symbolism alone. Roy stood at the front of the church in a dark jacket that fit him well and looked at her coming down the aisle the way that a man looks when he cannot quite believe his luck, which is precisely the way he should look. The minister performed the ceremony with appropriate gravity and genuine warmth, and when he pronounced them husband and wife and Roy kissed her, the small gathering made the kind of noise that small gatherings make when a thing that has been building for months finally arrives at its proper conclusion. Margaret Fairchild became Margaret Abbott on the 21st of January, 1879, and she left the church wearing his name as surely as she had ridden into Caldwell wearing the black of her grief, and the two garments were both true, both part of the story, and the second had been built from the first in the way that new things are sometimes built from difficult ones. The reception was held in the Cattleman's Rest, which was closed to regular business for the afternoon, and Hetty had cooked enough food for twice the gathering, and the harmonica player was present and played everything he knew that was celebratory, and Roy danced with Margaret in the cleared center of the saloon floor to a waltz that was not precisely a waltz but close enough, and she put her hand on his shoulder and felt the solid reality of him, and thought that nothing in her future was certain. As nothing in anyone's future is certain, but that she was standing in the right place with the right person, and that was as much as any person could ask. The spring came to Caldwell with the extravagance of Kansas springs, the grass coming up improbably green and the sky doing complicated things with its clouds, and the creek on the Fairchild Abbott parcel running full and cold from the snowmelt. Roy had, in February, engaged a builder, and the building of the house had begun the first week of March. They rode out to see it every few days, sometimes daily, watching the stone walls rise from Thomas's foundation and become something new and their own. The trial of Cyrus Dole took place in Wichita in April. Margaret did not attend. She had given all the testimony she had to give, and she did not need to watch the conclusion. Edmund Pratt wrote to her with the result: guilty on the charge of fraudulent conveyance, guilty on the lesser charge of conspiracy, sentenced to 12 years in the territorial prison in Leavenworth. It was not everything. It was not a charge of murder proven in a court of law. But it was substantial, and Dole would spend the better part of the rest of his active life behind bars, and the land acquisitions he had made by fraudulent means were being reviewed by the territorial court, with the intention of returning what could be returned to the families from whom it had been taken. Margaret read the letter sitting at the new kitchen table in the house on Slate Creek, which was not quite finished but was finished enough to sit in, and the late April light came through the new windows and lay in warm squares on the floor, and she sat with the letter for a time and thought about Thomas, who had wanted to build here and had been killed before he could, and about herself, who had built here in his place and in her own, and about Roy, who would be home from town in an hour or two, and who she would show the letter to, and who would read it and put his arm around her and say something honest and true and unremarkable, and it would mean everything. The house was finished in June. It was a fine house by the standards of Sumner County, stone-walled and solid with windows that looked south over the prairie, and a porch that Roy had added to the plans, because Margaret had said she wanted a place to sit in the evenings, and the porch caught the evening light perfectly, which Roy pointed out was not an accident because he had measured the angle of the summer sun before he specified where the porch should go, which made Margaret laugh and then kiss him for the attentiveness of it. They moved in on a Saturday in late June with the help of several neighbors from the county, because by then they had neighbors who would come to help with a moving day, which was itself evidence of a life being built. Hetty came out from town in a wagon with the contents of Margaret's room from the Cattleman's Rest, and a great deal of food and strong opinions about the arrangement of furniture, all of which were correct. By evening the house was arranged and everyone had gone home, and Margaret and Roy sat on the south porch with the prairie spread before them under a sky that was going from gold to rose to the deep blue of full evening, and the first stars were appearing over the grass, and the creek was making its small constant sound somewhere in the cottonwoods. "This is it," Roy said, not as a conclusion but as a recognition. "Yes," she said, "this is it." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there with the evening coming on over the Kansas prairie, in the house that had been built on the foundation of both grief and hope, and it was entirely right and entirely theirs. The summer passed in the way that summers pass when the work is real and the company is good, which is to say too quickly and not quickly enough. Margaret learned the rhythms of the ranch, which was small but growing, Roy having brought in a modest herd of cattle and hired 2 ranch hands, brothers named Will and Daniel Foster, who were steady workers and good men. She discovered that she had an aptitude for the accounting side of a ranching operation that was not surprising given her childhood in her mother's boarding house, but was deeply satisfying in its application to something she was building herself. Roy told her once, coming in from the field and finding her at the kitchen table with the ranch account spread before her and a sharpened pencil behind her ear, that she was the most naturally competent person he had ever met, and she told him that was flattery, and he said it was not flattery. It was an observation, and she said the difference between the two was not always clear, and he pulled up a chair and sat down beside her and said, "When I say you're competent, I mean it the way I mean that the grass is good this year. It's just true." And she thought that was possibly the most thoroughly Roy Abbott thing he had ever said, and she loved him for it very specifically and rather deeply. In September, Margaret discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Roy on the porch in the evening, with the September light on the prairie that was the same light as the October they had first held hands by the creek, and Roy's face did something that had no category she could put it in, something that was joy and terror and love all at once, the face of a man receiving news that is the best news and the most serious news simultaneously. "When?" he said. "March," she said. He took her hand and held it for a long time, looking at the prairie, and then he looked at her and said, "I am going to be the kind of father whose children can come to him with anything." He said it like a promise, simple and complete. "I know," she said. "I have never doubted that." The winter of 1879 was cold and full and good. The ranch operated steadily, the cattle doing well in the stone-walled barn that Roy and the Foster brothers had built in the autumn. The house was warm, and the evenings were long and full of reading and conversation, and the particular domestic pleasure of two people who genuinely like each other's company, finding that daily life is not a diminishment of that company but an expansion of it. Margaret wrote to her mother in St. Louis, who she had been corresponding with regularly since August, and who had received the news of her remarriage with an initial caution that had given way, over the months, to a cautious optimism, and then to a genuine gladness, as Margaret's letters made clear how good Roy Abbott was. She sent her mother a photograph taken in Wichita on the December trip back from the territorial court, one of Roy and herself standing outside the courthouse, before the verdict, which meant they were both serious in it. But her mother wrote back and said that serious or not, the way Roy was standing beside Margaret told her everything she needed to know. Her mother came to visit in February, arriving on the Santa Fe stage with a trunk of gifts and the slightly stunned expression of a woman from St. Louis confronting the Kansas plains in winter for the first time. Eleanor Whitmore was 61, small and quick and sharp in the same way that Margaret was, and she and Roy took each other's measure at the stage stop, with the frank mutual assessment of people who both love the same person and need to know if the other is trustworthy. And within an hour they were sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee, and talking about Margaret as though she were not sitting right there, which Margaret found both irritating and profoundly reassuring. Her mother held her before she went asleep that first evening and said, "You found a good one, Maggie," which was her childhood name and which her mother only used when she meant something with her whole heart. Margaret said, "I know, Mama," and her mother said Thomas would be glad, and she believed it. The baby came in the first week of March, which was both on schedule and somehow entirely surprising, because nothing, Margaret discovered, prepares you adequately for the actual arrival of a child. He was born on a Tuesday morning with the first hints of spring in the air, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes and the creek beginning to run fast with melt. And he was healthy and loud, and had Roy's dark hair and Margaret's determined expression right from the first, which Hetty, who had come out to help with the birth, said was entirely appropriate and probably useful. Roy held his son in the afternoon of that Tuesday with the same face he had made when Margaret told him she was expecting, the face with no category, and he looked from the baby to Margaret and back again and said nothing for a long time, just held the boy and stood at the window with the March light coming in over the prairie. "What will we name him?" Margaret said. She was exhausted and clear-headed and very happy. Roy looked at her. "You should choose," he said. "James," she said. "James Thomas Abbott. James for my father and Thomas for Thomas." Roy nodded, and the nodding had the quality of the way he received all important things, completely and without ceremony, letting it simply be true. "James Thomas Abbott," he said, trying it. "That's a good name." James Thomas Abbott was a robust and opinionated baby who grew into a robust and opinionated toddler with his father's steadiness and his mother's determination. And the house on Slate Creek became, over the following years, the kind of house that has the quality of being genuinely inhabited, full of the evidence of a life being lived rather than maintained. Hetty Morse sold the Cattleman's Rest in 1882 to a man from Abilene who renamed it, and repainted it, and made it rather more respectable and rather less interesting. And Hetty came to live on the property with Margaret and Roy in a small addition Roy built for her at the north end of the house, which she insisted on paying for, and he insisted she should not, and they settled it by her paying for exactly half, which was characteristic of both of them. She was, in practice, family, and James called her Aunt Hetty, and she was satisfied with this. Edmund Pratt came to visit in the spring of 1883, old but sharply alert, on his way west to Santa Fe on personal business, and spent a week at the Abbott Ranch eating Hetty's cooking and playing chess with Roy and telling Margaret that the outcome of the Dole case had been, in his professional career, the thing he was most satisfied with having done. Not because it was the most complex case, he said. I've had more complex cases, but because it was the most right thing. Margaret poured him more tea and said, "You gave me what I needed to make it possible." "You gave me what I needed to make it worth doing," Edmund said, which was as close to sentimental as he ever got and which meant a great deal. In the summer of 1883, Margaret discovered she was expecting their second child, and she told Roy again on the porch in the evening, which was where they told each other things that mattered. And Roy's face did the same thing it had done the first time, the joy-terror-love thing, and he said, "Are you well?" Because that was the first thing always, and she said she was very well, and he held her hand and they watched the summer evening come over the prairie with James asleep inside, and the creek in the cottonwoods and the stone walls of their house solid around them. The second baby was a girl, born in February of 1884, and they named her Alina for Margaret's mother, who received the news by letter and wrote back in the large shaky script her hands had acquired in age, writing that she was crying, but that they were the very best kind of tears. Alina Abbott had Roy's amber eyes and Margaret's dark hair, and a personality that combined the best qualities of both, which was to say she was curious and patient and stubborn in the most productive way. The years moved through Caldwell the way years move on the plains, measurably and enormously, the cattle trade continuing its slow reorganization, the railroads extending and changing what was possible, the frontier closing as Roy had described it in the early days of their acquaintance. Roy continued as sheriff through 1884 and then accepted, the following year, a position as county deputy marshal that carried more authority and slightly less daily danger, and allowed him more time at the ranch, which was, by 1885, a proper working operation with 15 hands and a herd that had made them modestly but solidly prosperous. Margaret sat on the south porch of the house on Slate Creek on an evening in September of 1885 and watched her children playing in the last of the afternoon light. James at 6, already showing the long-legged build of his father, and Alina at 18 months tottering after him, with the focused determination of a child who has decided that whatever her brother is doing is worth doing. And Roy coming across from the barn with his hat pushed back and his jacket dusty, and his face easy in the way it was easy when the day's work was done, and he was coming home. He stopped at the porch steps and looked at her and at the children and at the house and the prairie behind it, and whatever he felt was entirely visible on his face because Roy Abbott had never learned to hide what he felt from the people he loved and had never tried to. "Good day," Margaret said. "Very good day," he said, and came up the steps and sat beside her, and she leaned into him as she had leaned into him on this porch 100 evenings before, and his arm came around her as it always did, without calculation or effort, simply because that was where it belonged. James came running up the porch steps with a grasshopper cupped in his hands, and presented it to his mother with the deep satisfaction of a 6-year-old, who has accomplished something genuinely difficult. And Margaret examined the grasshopper with the appropriate gravity and said it was an excellent specimen. And Roy leaned forward and agreed that it was a very fine grasshopper indeed. And James beamed and ran back down to show it to his sister, who fell over trying to see it, and got up immediately and tried again. The September light was on the prairie, the same light that had been there the October morning she first rode to Slate Creek with Roy, the same light that had been on the creek and the cottonwoods and Thomas's unfinished foundation. And it was different now because she was different, built differently, built from everything that had happened. The grief and the determination and the long, careful preparation and the corner table in the Cattleman's Rest, and the hand held in the cottonwood shade, and the December courtroom and the January church, and the March babies and the South Porch evenings. She had ridden into Caldwell wearing widow's black, and she had left wearing his name, and his name was hers and hers was his, and the name was written on the deed of the land, and in the family Bible, and in the school register where James Thomas Abbott's name would appear in the autumn, and it was real and permanent and fully present in the world in the way that only things built honestly and with full attention can be. "I was thinking," Roy said, beside her in the evening, his voice that unhurried and direct voice she had loved from the morning she first heard it at the bar of the Cattleman's Rest, "that we might extend the east pasture come spring. The Foster boys think the land across the creek would carry another 30 head. Will and Daniel have good judgment," Margaret said. "They do," Roy said. They sat for a while in the quiet that was not empty but full of the creek sound and the children and the cattle and the evening. And the last of the September sun went down over the Kansas prairie in the way that September suns go down over the Kansas prairie, which is to say with an extravagance of color that the flat land seems to summon out of the sheer scale of its sky, gold and rose, and the deep particular blue that Margaret had worn at her wedding, and the first stars came out over the grass. Eleanor had been retrieved from the yard by Hetty, who appeared for this purpose at the kitchen door, and collected her with the efficient tenderness of a woman who has decided that being a grandmother is not strictly dependent on biology. James sat on the porch step, cleaning his now-released grasshoppers, travels off his hands with a focus that children bring to even the most mundane tasks. The horses were in the barn. The ranch was quiet. The stone walls of the house were solid around them. Margaret thought of Thomas, as she still sometimes did, not with the grief that had carried her to Caldwell, but with the simpler and more generous feeling that time and happiness allow, the feeling of being glad a person existed even when they are gone, of being grateful for what was given even when it was taken back. Thomas had wanted to build on this land, and the land had been built on, and there was a house where there had been a foundation, and there were children where there had been no children, and there was Roy. There was Roy, who was everything that Thomas had described in his letters without knowing he was describing him, steady and honest and good, whose presence in her world had been the thing she did not plan for and could not now imagine being without. She turned to look at him in the last of the evening light, and he was already looking at her the way he had always looked at her, with the amber eyes and the complete and uncomplicated attention. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. It was not the first time they had said it, and it would not be the last, and each time it had the quality of the first time, because they had both come to it late and honestly, and it had not lost any of its weight in the saying. James went inside when Hetty called supper. The stars came out over the prairie, large and close the way they are large and close on the plains where there is nothing to diminish them. Roy and Margaret sat on their porch in the September evening with the whole of their life around them, built from loss and love, and the particular determination of two people who had decided, in a cattle town in Kansas in 1878, that the future was worth building toward, and they were entirely right, and they had built it, and it was good.